Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment below and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in and let's begin. Marguerite Rousseau stared at the blood-stained daguerreotype in her trembling hands, the image showing her beloved Remy Thibault standing over the bodies of 3 children, their small forms twisted in death, while he smiled with satisfaction that made her stomach turn with revulsion and disbelief. The photograph had been hidden in his saddlebags among other trophies of violence: scalps, jewelry torn from victims, and newspaper clippings that documented a career of butchery that had made him wealthy beyond most men's dreams. The bounty hunter who'd promised her fortune and a future filled with comfort had built his prosperity on the murder of innocents, whose only crime had been existing in territories where lawlessness made killing profitable for men without conscience. The wedding dress hanging in her bedroom seemed to mock her now, its white silk and delicate lace a symbol of purity that would be forever stained by marriage to someone whose hands were soaked in the blood of children, women, and helpless men who'd been hunted like animals for bounties that paid better than honest work. Remy had courted her with gifts bought using money earned through systematic murder, his gentle words and romantic gestures funded by atrocities that would have horrified decent people if they'd known the true source of his apparently limitless wealth. Every flower he'd brought her, every piece of jewelry he'd placed around her neck, every promise of security he'd made had been purchased with human suffering that defied comprehension. The sound of his approaching footsteps on the porch of their isolated Montana cabin sent terror and revulsion through her chest as she realized she was alone with a monster whose true nature had been hidden beneath a facade of charm and generosity that had fooled everyone in Silver Creek, including herself. The man she'd agreed to marry in 3 days was not the successful businessman he'd claimed to be, but a predator whose specialty was hunting human beings for profit, someone who killed families for bounties and kept souvenirs of his victims like trophies from successful hunts. Her fiancé was a professional killer whose reputation for brutality was legendary among the criminal underworld that paid him to eliminate problems that couldn't be solved through legal means. The realization that she'd fallen in love with evil incarnate was almost too overwhelming to process rationally, but the evidence was undeniable and damning beyond any possibility of misunderstanding or innocent explanation. The photographs, the scalps, the detailed records of murders committed for money, all of it painted a picture of systematic cruelty that had funded the comfortable life he'd promised to share with her. The gentle lover who'd held her so tenderly was the same man who'd tortured information from victims before killing them slowly. The romantic suitor who'd whispered sweet promises was someone who specialized in making death as painful as possible for people whose only crime was having bounties placed on their heads. As Remy's familiar knock echoed through the cabin door, Marguerite faced the most terrifying moment of her life, confronting the man she loved with evidence of crimes that proved he was a monster, while knowing that her discovery of his secrets might make her his next victim if he decided that dead wives told no tales. The choice between fleeing into the wilderness where she'd probably die alone and staying to face a killer whose reaction to exposure was impossible to predict seemed like choosing between different forms of suicide. But running was no longer an option when his presence filled the doorway like death itself. The woman who'd planned to become his wife in 3 days now had to decide whether to become his accuser, his victim, or something else entirely that she couldn't yet imagine, but knew would change her forever. 6 months earlier, Marguerite had been the most eligible woman in Silver Creek, Montana, her beauty matched only by her intelligence and her determination to build a life that honored the memory of her parents, who died defending their homestead from raiders 3 years before. As the town's schoolteacher and the inheritor of a modest but productive ranch, she'd attracted suitors from across the territory. But none had impressed her with their character or prospects until the day Remy Thibault had ridden into town with enough gold to buy anything he wanted and the manners of someone who'd been educated far beyond what frontier life typically produced. His arrival had created a sensation among the townspeople who rarely saw strangers with such obvious wealth and sophistication, his expensive clothes and fine horses suggesting success in business ventures that had made him rich enough to retire young and seek a wife worthy of sharing his prosperity. The story he'd told about striking gold in California and investing his profits in freight businesses throughout the territory had seemed completely believable, especially when supported by the evidence of his spending habits and his knowledge of commercial enterprises that spanned multiple states and territories. The attention he'd focused on Marguerite from his first day in Silver Creek had been flattering and overwhelming, with gifts that showed both generosity and understanding of her tastes and interests. The books of poetry he'd brought from San Francisco, the silk dress he'd ordered from New York, the musical instruments he'd purchased because she'd mentioned loving to sing. All of these demonstrated thoughtfulness that went beyond mere wealth to encompass genuine interest in her happiness and personal fulfillment. His courtship had been romantic but respectful, passionate but patient, creating exactly the kind of relationship she'd dreamed of finding with someone who could appreciate her mind as well as her beauty. The conversations they'd shared during long evenings on her porch had revealed depths of intelligence and experience that made him fascinating company. His stories of distant places and different cultures expanding her understanding of possibilities that existed beyond the limited horizons of frontier life. His questions about her own dreams and ambitions had shown genuine interest in her thoughts and feelings, while his encouragement of her teaching work had demonstrated respect for her independence and professional competence that most men would have seen as threatening rather than admirable. The proposal he'd made after 3 months of courtship had been everything a romantic woman could desire, delivered in a garden he'd planted specifically for that purpose, accompanied by a ring that had cost more than most people earned in a year, and supported by detailed plans for a future that would take them to cities where culture and refinement were available to people with sufficient wealth to enjoy them. His promise that she would never want for anything had seemed like a guarantee of happiness rather than a threat, making his apparent wealth seem like evidence of competence rather than something to question or investigate. The man who'd swept her off her feet had seemed too good to be true, and now she was learning that her instincts had been more accurate than she'd wanted to believe. The months of their engagement had been a whirlwind of preparations and celebrations that had made Marguerite feel like a princess in a fairy tale, with Remy's unlimited resources creating possibilities she'd never imagined for their wedding and their future together. The house he was building for them outside Silver Creek was magnificent by territorial standards, with imported materials and architectural details that rivaled mansions in established cities back east. His ability to make her dreams reality through simple applications of wealth had seemed like magic, making her feel cherished and protected in ways that went beyond mere romantic attachment to encompass security that would last a lifetime. The respect he'd earned from Silver Creek's business community had enhanced her own social standing, with his investments in local enterprises creating jobs and prosperity that benefited the entire town. His generous donations to the school where she taught had provided books and supplies that improved education for every child in the community, while his funding of church improvements had made him popular with religious leaders who saw him as a blessing to their congregation. The man she was planning to marry had become the most influential citizen in town within months of his arrival, using his wealth to build relationships and establish himself as someone whose presence made life better for everyone around him. The tenderness he'd shown in their private moments together had convinced her that his public success was matched by personal qualities that would make him an ideal husband, his gentle touch and patient restraint proving that his strength was controlled by moral principles rather than mere self-interest. Their conversations about the future had revealed shared values and compatible goals. While his obvious adoration for her had made her feel beautiful and valued in ways that had healed wounds left by her parents' violent deaths. The security he offered wasn't just financial, it was emotional and spiritual, promising partnership with someone whose love would protect her from a world that had already proven its capacity for sudden tragedy. The wedding preparations had become a community celebration, with the entire town investing themselves in creating a ceremony that would reflect both Remy's prosperity and Marguerite's popularity among people who'd watched her overcome adversity with grace and determination. The dress he'd commissioned from a seamstress in Denver was a work of art that had cost more than most families' annual income, while the reception he was planning would feature luxuries that Silver Creek's residents would remember for decades. Their marriage was being treated as the social event of the year, with guests traveling from neighboring territories to witness the union of two people whose love story had captured everyone's imagination. But beneath the excitement and celebration, small details had begun to create doubt that Marguerite had tried to ignore, because acknowledging them would have meant questioning everything she believed about the man she loved. His reluctance to discuss his past in detail, his habit of changing the subject when asked about his family or childhood, his tendency to disappear for days at a time on mysterious business trips that he claimed were too boring to explain, all of these had seemed like minor quirks rather than warning signs until the discovery in his saddlebags had revealed them as evidence of deception that went far deeper than simple privacy about personal history. The perfect suitor who'd seemed too good to be true had been exactly that, a carefully constructed fiction designed to hide the reality of someone whose wealth came from sources that would have horrified anyone who learned the truth about his profession. The systematic search of Remy's belongings that followed her discovery of the photograph revealed the full scope of his deception, with evidence of crimes that spanned years and covered territory from Mexico to Canada in a career of violence that had made him one of the most feared and successful bounty hunters in the American West. The detailed records he kept of his kills were organized with the precision of a businessman tracking inventory, each entry including victim descriptions, bounty amounts, and personal notes about methods that had proven most effective for extracting information or inflicting suffering before death finally ended his victim's torment. The collection of personal items taken from his victims was stored like treasure, with jewelry, photographs, and locks of hair arranged in a macabre museum that celebrated the lives he'd ended for profit. Children's toys sat beside women's wedding rings, while men's watches were displayed next to scalps that had been carefully prepared and preserved as trophies of successful hunts. The sick pride he took in his work was evident in the care with which these souvenirs had been maintained, each item tagged with dates and locations that turned murder into a hobby he'd pursued with enthusiasm that went beyond mere professional competence. The letters from clients who'd hired his services revealed the scope of his criminal network, with wealthy criminals, corrupt politicians, and business rivals using his expertise to eliminate problems that couldn't be solved through legal means. The amounts he charged for his services were staggering, with individual contracts worth more than honest men earned in lifetimes of hard work, while his reputation for reliability and discretion had made him the preferred choice for anyone needing someone killed quietly and efficiently. His clients trusted him with their darkest secrets because they knew he was as committed to their success as they were to his continued prosperity. The maps marking locations of future contracts showed that his retirement to Silver Creek had been temporary, a brief interlude in a career that he'd planned to resume after marriage, provided him with cover and respectability that would make his activities less suspicious to law enforcement. Marguerite's role in his plans had been to serve as camouflage for continued killing, her innocence and social standing providing protection for someone whose true profession would have made him unwelcome in decent society if anyone had known the source of his wealth and influence. The financial records documenting his investments revealed how murder money had been laundered through legitimate businesses, creating an empire of apparently respectable enterprises that generated income while hiding the criminal activities that had provided their initial funding. The man she'd believed to be a successful businessman was actually a killer whose ventures were designed to explain wealth that couldn't be accounted for through honest work, making his entire public persona nothing more than an elaborate disguise for evil that defied comprehension. The discovery that she'd been chosen as an unwitting accomplice in maintaining his deception was almost as horrifying as learning about his crimes, making her feel complicit in atrocities she'd never imagined anyone could commit for money. The moment Remy entered the cabin and saw the evidence of his crimes spread across their kitchen table, his transformation from loving fiancé to dangerous predator was instantaneous and terrifying, his gentle mask dropping to reveal the cold calculation of someone whose survival had always depended on eliminating threats to his security. The smile that had once made her heart race now revealed teeth that seemed predatory, while his eyes held depths of cruelty that made her understand why his victims had probably begged for death long before he'd been willing to grant it. The man she'd planned to marry was gone, replaced by the killer whose reputation had made him wealthy through systematic brutality. "You shouldn't have looked through my things," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same tone he might have used to comment on the weather, while his hand moved toward the gun that never left his side even in their most intimate moments. Curiosity killed the cat, as they say, and cats are much harder to replace than troublesome women who can't mind their own business. The casual way he discussed her potential murder while standing in the kitchen where they'd shared so many meals made her realize that killing her would cause him no more emotional distress than disposing of any other inconvenience that threatened his carefully maintained deception. The explanation he offered for his profession was delivered without apology or shame, his matter-of-fact description of hunting human beings for bounties presented as if it were any other legitimate business venture that required specialized skills and professional competence. "People need killing," he said with a shrug that dismissed the moral implications of his work. "I'm good at it, and the pay is excellent. Your precious civilization depends on men like me to handle problems that your laws can't touch. So don't pretend to be shocked by necessities that keep your comfortable world functioning properly." His justification revealed philosophical darkness that went beyond mere criminality to encompass contempt for the society that had secretly benefited from his services. The threats that followed were implicit but unmistakable. His description of what happened to people who betrayed his trust, delivered with clinical detail that left no doubt about her fate if she chose to expose his secrets to authorities who would never believe her word against his carefully established reputation. "Dead women tell no tales," he said with the same gentle smile that had once made her feel safe and cherished. "And grieving widowers receive sympathy rather than suspicion when their beloved wives suffer tragic accidents in dangerous frontier territory where anything can happen to careless people who wander too far from safety." The ease with which he planned her murder while discussing their upcoming wedding made her understand that she'd never really known him at all. But the most chilling revelation was his admission that her discovery of his secrets didn't necessarily mean her death, because wives who understood their husband's business could be valuable partners rather than dangerous liabilities if they possessed the intelligence to appreciate their privileged position. "You could join me instead of fighting me," he offered with the same tone he'd used to propose marriage. "Intelligent women make excellent accomplices, and the money we could earn together would buy anything your heart desires. All you have to do is forget your silly moral objections and embrace the opportunities that partnership with someone of my capabilities would provide." The suggestion that she become his accomplice in murder was presented as if it were a reasonable career choice, rather than a descent into evil that would damn her soul forever. The night that followed Remy's revelation was the longest of Marguerite's life, with sleep impossible while she lay beside a man whose gentle breathing masked the mind of a killer who'd offered her partnership in atrocities or death as her only alternatives to exposure that would destroy them both. His arm across her waist felt like a chain binding her to evil, while his peaceful expression in moonlight streaming through their bedroom window made his capacity for violence seem like a nightmare that should disappear with dawn. But the evidence of his crimes remained spread across their kitchen table, like accusations that couldn't be denied or explained away through wishful thinking. The practical considerations of her situation were almost as terrifying as the moral implications, because running would mean abandoning everything she'd built in Silver Creek while facing wilderness survival with limited supplies and no destination that offered safety from someone whose profession was tracking people who didn't want to be found. Remy's skills as a bounty hunter would make hiding from him nearly impossible, while his network of criminal contacts could provide assistance in locating anyone foolish enough to believe they could disappear permanently from someone with his resources and determination. Escape seemed like suicide with extra steps, offering the illusion of choice while leading inevitably to the same fatal conclusion. The alternative of accepting his offer to become his partner was equally impossible for someone whose entire life had been built around helping others and contributing positively to her community, making the suggestion that she participate in murder feel like spiritual death that would be worse than physical destruction. The money he offered could buy anything material she might desire, but it would be paid for with innocent blood that would stain her soul beyond any possibility of redemption or forgiveness. The choice between dying as herself or living as someone she couldn't recognize felt like no choice at all, because both options would destroy the person she'd worked so hard to become. The realization that love could survive knowledge of evil was perhaps the most disturbing discovery of all, because her feelings for Remy hadn't disappeared with the revelation of his crimes, but had instead been complicated by understanding that made simple rejection impossible. The man who'd murdered children was also the person who'd held her when nightmares about her parents' death had made sleep impossible, while the killer who collected scalps was someone who'd shown infinite patience when teaching her to ride horses and shoot guns for protection. The complexity of human nature that allowed gentleness and brutality to coexist in a single person challenged everything she'd believed about morality and justice. The sound of Remy stirring beside her as dawn approached meant that her time for decision was ending, because continuing to pretend ignorance while sharing a bed with someone whose true nature she now understood would be impossible to sustain without arousing suspicions that could prove fatal. The choice that had seemed impossible in darkness felt even more overwhelming in the gray light of morning that revealed how completely her safe world had been shattered by knowledge that changed everything about her future. Whatever decision she made in the next few minutes would determine not just whether she lived or died, but who she would become if survival required embracing evil or choosing death, rather than compromise with forces that threatened everything she'd ever valued or believed. The conversation that began over breakfast coffee was unlike any Marguerite had ever imagined having, with her acceptance of Remy's offer delivered in terms that surprised both of them with their practical consideration of details that would govern their criminal partnership. "If I'm going to help you," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the moral earthquake that was reshaping everything about her identity, "then I need to understand exactly what you do and how you do it. I won't be a blind accomplice who can be discarded when my ignorance becomes inconvenient." Her demand for full disclosure revealed strength that had emerged from the ashes of her former innocence, making her a different person than she'd been just hours earlier. The negotiation that followed established ground rules for their collaboration that reflected her determination to maintain some control over the descent into darkness that accepting his lifestyle would require. She would help with planning and logistics but wouldn't participate in actual killing. Her role focused on intelligence gathering and maintaining their respectable cover rather than pulling triggers or wielding knives that would make her directly responsible for ending lives. The compromise was morally meaningless but psychologically necessary, allowing her to convince herself that degrees of complicity might preserve something of her soul even while damning it through association with atrocities. Remy's surprise at her practical approach to criminal partnership was balanced by obvious relief that her choice eliminated the necessity of killing someone whose death would have complicated his situation in Silver Creek, while attracting unwanted attention from authorities who might investigate too thoroughly. Her willingness to become his accomplice was more valuable than her death would have been, because intelligent partners were rare in his profession, while dead bodies created problems that money couldn't always solve. The transformation of their romantic relationship into criminal collaboration was handled with the same matter-of-fact efficiency that characterized all his professional dealings. The training that began immediately focused on skills that would make her useful in situations where traditional feminine roles could provide cover for activities that would seem suspicious if undertaken by men alone. Her education in reading people's expressions and body language, identifying threats and opportunities in social situations, and maintaining convincing performances under pressure revealed that successful criminality required many of the same talents that made someone effective in legitimate professions. The difference was in how those skills were applied and what they were used to accomplish. The psychological adaptation required for their new partnership was more difficult than the practical aspects, because accepting that she could love someone capable of murdering children required abandoning moral certainties that had previously defined her character and values. The woman who dedicated her life to teaching and nurturing young minds was becoming someone who would help plan their destruction for profit, while the person who'd believed in justice and law was embracing a worldview that saw violence as simply another tool for achieving desired outcomes. The transformation was complete and irreversible, marking the death of Marguerite Rousseau, the schoolteacher, and the birth of someone whose identity would be forever linked to evil she'd once considered unimaginable. Their initial collaboration came within a week of her decision to join Remy's criminal enterprise, when a wealthy cattle baron from Colorado contacted him about eliminating a family of homesteaders whose legal claim to valuable grazing land was threatening a business empire built on illegal occupation of territorial property. The contract was worth more money than Marguerite had ever seen in her life, but the target was a family with 3 children, whose only crime was filing legitimate homestead claims that challenged fraudulent ownership of public lands. The job would require killing 5 innocent people whose deaths would benefit someone rich enough to buy murder as casually as most people purchased livestock. Marguerite's role in planning the operation was to develop a cover story that would explain their presence in the area while gathering intelligence about the family's routines and vulnerabilities that would make the killings appear accidental rather than deliberate murder. Her suggestion that they pose as a married couple interested in purchasing nearby property was accepted enthusiastically, because her respectable appearance and teaching background would make their presence seem innocent to anyone who might later be questioned by investigators. The irony of using her reputation for virtue to facilitate evil was not lost on either of them. The research phase of the operation took 2 weeks, during which they lived in a hotel in the nearest town while Marguerite gathered information through casual conversations with merchants, bank officials, and local residents who were happy to discuss their neighbors with friendly strangers who seemed interested in joining their community. Her natural charm and apparent innocence made people eager to share details about the homesteading family's habits, financial situation, and relationships with others in the area, providing intelligence that would be used to ensure their deaths looked like accidents rather than executions. The moral weight of planning the murder of children was almost unbearable, but Marguerite forced herself to focus on practical considerations rather than emotional responses that would interfere with her ability to function as Remy's partner. She documented the family's routines with the same attention to detail she'd once applied to lesson planning, while her observations about their vulnerabilities were recorded with clinical precision that ignored the humanity of people whose lives she was helping to end. The transformation from teacher to accomplice required suppressing empathy that would make the work impossible to complete successfully. The final plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity, calling for a nighttime fire that would trap the family in their cabin, while appearing to be the result of an overturned lamp or faulty chimney that caused tragic but understandable accidents in frontier homes where such disasters were common enough to avoid suspicion. Remy's expertise in making murder look like misfortune would ensure that no investigation would reveal evidence of deliberate killing, while the cattle baron's influence with local authorities would discourage thorough examination of events that benefited his business interests. As they prepared to execute their first joint operation, Marguerite realized that she'd crossed a line from which there could be no return, making her equally responsible for whatever happened to the innocent family, whose only mistake had been trusting in laws that couldn't protect them from people wealthy enough to buy their deaths. The execution of the Homestead family was carried out with professional efficiency that left no evidence of foul play, the cabin fire burning hot enough to destroy any traces of accelerant while consuming the bodies of 5 people whose deaths would be mourned by no one with enough influence to demand thorough investigation. Marguerite's role was limited to maintaining watch while Remy did the actual killing, but her complicity was complete regardless of who struck the matches that turned a family home into a funeral pyre that lit the Montana sky like a beacon announcing the birth of a new kind of evil in Silver Creek's respectable schoolteacher. The payment they received for the contract was delivered in gold coins that felt heavier than their actual weight would suggest, each piece representing a portion of the innocent lives that had been traded for money that could buy anything except redemption for souls that had been sold to finance a lifestyle that would depend on continued killing for its maintenance. The cattle baron's satisfaction with their work was expressed through additional contracts that would keep them busy throughout the territory, making it clear that success in their chosen profession would require regular participation in atrocities that would become routine rather than exceptional events requiring moral preparation. The return to Silver Creek was complicated by the necessity of maintaining their public personas while processing the psychological impact of shared participation in multiple murders that had been planned and executed with the same attention to detail that most people applied to legitimate business ventures. Marguerite's role as beloved schoolteacher had to continue, despite her knowledge that the hands that would teach children to read were the same ones that had helped plan the deaths of other children whose futures had been ended for money. The disconnect between her public and private identities created mental strain that threatened her ability to function normally in social situations. The wedding plans that resumed upon their return took on surreal quality, with preparations for a ceremony celebrating love and commitment, proceeding while both bride and groom understood that their union was actually a business partnership dedicated to killing people for profit. The dress that had once symbolized purity now felt like a costume designed to hide the reality of what she'd become, while the vows they would exchange had been transformed from promises of mutual devotion into agreements about how to divide profits from future murders. The sacred ceremony would be a mockery of everything marriage was supposed to represent. But the most disturbing aspect of their transformation was how quickly the psychological adjustment to their new lifestyle had occurred, with guilt and horror giving way to practical considerations about efficiency and profit margins that made murder feel like any other skilled profession requiring expertise and attention to detail. The woman who'd once wept over injured animals was learning to discuss human targets with the same detachment that businessmen used when evaluating investments, while her capacity for empathy was being systematically destroyed through exposure to suffering that had to be ignored if she wanted to remain functional as Remy's partner. The gold they'd earned felt like payment for more than the homesteaders' lives, It was compensation for the death of her own humanity, purchased at a price that no amount of money could ever repay. The ceremony that united Marguerite and Remy in marriage was attended by the entire population of Silver Creek, with townspeople who considered them the perfect couple, celebrating a union that represented hope and prosperity in a community that had seen too much hardship and loss. The bride's radiant beauty was commented on by everyone present, while the groom's obvious adoration and abundant wealth made him the envy of every unmarried man in attendance. The wedding was everything a romantic celebration should be, except for the fact that it was joining two killers whose partnership was dedicated to evil that would have horrified everyone witnessing their vows. Father Marchand's blessing of their union carried ironic weight as he asked God to guide their steps and bless their endeavors, unknowingly invoking divine approval for a relationship built on shared participation in murder for profit. The vows they exchanged promised love, honor, and fidelity that had been redefined by their criminal partnership, with traditional words carrying meanings that would have shocked anyone who understood what they were actually pledging to support in each other. The sacred ceremony was simultaneously genuine and fraudulent, celebrating real emotions while concealing the evil that had brought them together. The reception that followed showcased Remy's wealth through extravagances that impressed guests while serving as advertisements for the prosperity that crime could provide for people skilled enough to avoid consequences and ruthless enough to ignore moral constraints. The food was imported from distant cities, the music was provided by professional entertainers hired for the occasion, and the gifts were distributed with generosity that made Remy beloved by everyone who benefited from his apparent success in legitimate business ventures. The celebration was funded by blood money, but the guests who enjoyed it saw only evidence of good fortune and hard work. The congratulations they received from friends and neighbors carried particular poignancy because the well-wishers were celebrating the happiness of people whose relationship was based on shared guilt rather than shared innocence, making their joy seem like unwitting approval of evil that would continue to flourish under cover of respectability. Mayor Dubois' toast to their future prosperity was especially ironic, since their actual plans for generating wealth would involve killing anyone who threatened the interests of clients wealthy enough to afford their services. The community that was embracing them as model citizens was unknowingly harboring predators whose presence would eventually bring danger to everyone they claimed to care about. The dance that concluded the evening was performed by newlyweds, whose steps were synchronized by shared secrets rather than mere romantic attraction. Their movements reflecting the partnership they'd forged through participation in atrocities that had bonded them more completely than any legal ceremony could accomplish. As they moved together across the floor while their friends and neighbors watched with approval and envy, Marguerite and Remy understood that their marriage had made them more dangerous rather than more respectable, because their combined skills and resources would make them capable of crimes that neither could have accomplished alone. The wedding night that awaited them would celebrate not just physical union, but criminal partnership that would write their names in blood across territories where innocence was a luxury that few could afford, and justice was available only to those with enough money to purchase it from professionals like themselves. The months following their wedding brought a steady stream of contracts that established Remy and Marguerite as the most efficient killing team in the Western Territories, their combination of his violent expertise and her social skills making them uniquely qualified for eliminating targets that required both precision and discretion. Their reputation spread through criminal networks that connected corrupt politicians, business rivals, and wealthy criminals who needed problems solved permanently without official investigations that might expose their own illegal activities. The demand for their services seemed unlimited, with each successful contract leading to more lucrative opportunities that tested their skills while expanding their influence. Marguerite's role in their operations had evolved beyond simple intelligence gathering to encompass recruitment of local accomplices, development of escape routes, and creation of alibis that would protect them from suspicion when their work inevitably attracted law enforcement attention. Her background as a teacher had provided training in organization and planning that proved invaluable when applied to criminal enterprises requiring complex coordination of multiple moving parts. The skills that had once been used to educate children were now employed to facilitate their murder, making her transformation from educator to killer particularly grotesque in its perversion of abilities meant to nurture rather than destroy. The financial rewards of their partnership had exceeded even Remy's optimistic projections, with their combined earnings in 6 months surpassing what most people accumulated in lifetimes of honest labor. The investments they made in legitimate businesses provided cover for their criminal income while creating additional streams of revenue that would sustain them if their killing careers were ever compromised by exposure or injury. Their wealth was growing so rapidly that spending it became a challenge, requiring careful attention to avoid attracting suspicion from authorities who might wonder about the source of such sudden prosperity. The psychological toll of their work was managed through careful compartmentalization that allowed them to function normally in social situations while suppressing awareness of the evil they committed in private. Marguerite had developed techniques for maintaining her public persona as beloved teacher and community leader while conducting business that required calculating the most efficient methods for ending human lives. The mental discipline required for such deception was exhausting but necessary because exposure would mean death for both of them, regardless of how much money they'd accumulated or how many powerful allies they'd cultivated. But the most disturbing aspect of their success was how natural their criminal partnership had become, with murder planning integrated into their daily routines as smoothly as household chores or social obligations. They discussed killing strategies over breakfast with the same casual efficiency that other couples use to coordinate shopping trips or social engagements, while their debates about the most effective torture techniques were conducted with the intellectual rigor that scholars applied to academic questions. The normalization of evil had been so complete that they no longer recognized how far they'd fallen from anything resembling human decency, making their continued survival dependent on maintaining psychological blindness to their own moral corruption. The contract that changed everything came from a businessman in Denver whose estranged daughter had inherited property that threatened his plans for commercial development, making her elimination necessary for preserving investments that represented his life's work. The target was a young widow with 2 small children who'd done nothing more threatening than exist. But her legal ownership of valuable real estate made her death worth $5,000 to someone who viewed murder as a reasonable solution to property disputes. The assignment seemed routine until Marguerite saw a photograph of the woman who looked exactly like her sister had before raiders had killed her along with their parents 3 years earlier. The psychological shock of seeing her sister's face in a stranger's photograph triggered memories that had been suppressed through the mental discipline required for functioning as a professional killer, bringing back emotions and values that had been buried under layers of moral compromise and criminal habituation. The woman they'd been hired to murder had the same gentle smile, the same kind eyes, the same protective stance while holding her children that had characterized the sister whose death had been one of the tragedies that had shaped Marguerite's early adult life. The target wasn't just another anonymous victim, she was a mirror reflecting the person Marguerite had once been before choosing evil over virtue. The planning session that should have been routine became psychological torture as Marguerite struggled to apply her analytical skills to destroying someone who represented everything she'd lost when her family had been killed by men who were fundamentally no different from what she and Remy had become. The irony of having transformed into the kind of person who'd murdered her parents was so overwhelming that maintaining her usual professional detachment became impossible, forcing her to confront the reality of what she'd become through choices that had seemed logical at the time, but now appeared to be steps toward damnation. Remy's impatience with her emotional struggles revealed how completely he'd been corrupted by years of killing for money. His inability to understand her distress, proving that whatever humanity he'd once possessed had been destroyed by systematic participation in evil that had made compassion a liability rather than a virtue. His practical focus on the technical aspects of the operation, while dismissing her concerns about killing someone who resembled her dead sister, showed that he'd become a machine designed for efficient murder rather than a human being capable of moral reasoning or emotional connection beyond what served his professional interests. The crisis of conscience that paralyzed Marguerite's ability to participate in planning the Denver operation forced her to examine choices that had led from helping a wounded stranger to becoming someone who could calmly discuss the best methods for murdering innocent mothers and children. The woman who'd once risked her life to protect students from schoolyard bullies was now part of a team that specialized in destroying families for money, while the person who'd dedicated her life to nurturing young minds was planning to leave two small children orphaned for the financial benefit of someone who viewed their mother's death as a business expense. The realization that she'd become everything she'd once fought against was so devastating that continuing to function as Remy's partner suddenly seemed impossible, regardless of the consequences that withdrawal from their criminal lifestyle might bring. The argument that erupted between Marguerite and Remy over the Denver contract was the first serious conflict in their criminal partnership, with her refusal to participate in killing the widow and her children, creating tensions that threatened to destroy the professional and personal relationship that had made them both wealthy and successful. His accusations that she was allowing sentiment to interfere with business reflected his complete transformation into someone for whom human life had no value beyond its potential for generating profit. While her insistence that some lines couldn't be crossed revealed that remnants of her former moral compass had survived their journey into darkness. The ultimatum he delivered was simple and non-negotiable. Either she would overcome her squeamishness and fulfill her role in the operation, or he would complete the contract alone, while reconsidering whether their partnership had become a liability that threatened his ability to function effectively as a professional killer. His willingness to abandon their marriage and criminal collaboration for the sake of maintaining his reputation among clients who valued reliability above all other considerations showed how thoroughly money had replaced love as his primary motivation for all decisions. The woman he'd courted and married had become expendable if she couldn't contribute to his continued success. Marguerite's realization that she'd become trapped between impossible choices, participating in the murder of someone who reminded her of her beloved sister, or facing Remy's retaliation for betraying their criminal partnership, forced her to confront the reality that escape from their lifestyle might require sacrifices that would be almost as devastating as continued participation in atrocities. Her knowledge of his methods and clients made her a threat that couldn't be allowed to exist independently, while her emotional attachment to him complicated any plans for simple flight that might have protected innocent lives by removing her expertise from future operations. The decision to warn the Denver widow about the contract on her life was made impulsively, driven by moral instincts that had been dormant for months but hadn't been completely destroyed by her participation in evil that had violated everything she'd once believed about right and wrong. The letter she sent contained enough information to allow the woman to flee with her children while avoiding details that would definitely implicate Marguerite in the plot against their lives. The warning was a betrayal of everything her partnership with Remy represented, but it was also the first morally defensible action she'd taken since agreeing to become his accomplice in murder for profit. The knowledge that Remy would discover her sabotage when the Denver operation failed created terror that went beyond fear of physical punishment to encompass understanding that she'd committed an act of defiance that would transform her from trusted partner into enemy whose elimination would become necessary for protecting his professional reputation. The man who'd loved her enough to offer partnership in his criminal enterprise would feel equally justified in killing her for betraying the trust that had made their success possible. As she waited for his return from Denver with news that the targets had disappeared, Marguerite prepared for a confrontation that would determine whether redemption was possible for someone who'd fallen as far as she had, or whether the choice between evil and death was the only option available to people who'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Remy's return from Denver was marked by a fury that transformed their elegant home into something that felt more like a trap than a sanctuary. His discovery that their targets had fled hours before his arrival, making it clear that someone had warned them about the contract on their lives. The systematic destruction of their living room as he searched for evidence of betrayal was accompanied by accusations delivered in tones that promised violence if his suspicions about Marguerite's involvement were confirmed. The man who'd once been her gentle lover was revealing the predator that had always existed beneath his civilized facade, making her understand that she was facing someone for whom killing had become as natural as breathing. The interrogation that followed was conducted with the same professional efficiency that characterized all his work, with questions designed to trap her in lies, while physical intimidation escalated toward torture that would extract the truth regardless of her willingness to cooperate voluntarily. His expertise in breaking people who didn't want to reveal information was being applied to the woman he'd married, transforming their bedroom into an improvised torture chamber where love was replaced by methodical brutality that served his professional needs rather than personal emotions. The transition from husband to interrogator was seamless and terrifying, proving that his capacity for violence had no limits based on previous emotional attachments. The confession he extracted through carefully applied pain was delivered through tears and broken ribs that made speaking almost impossible. But her admission that she'd warned the Denver family was accompanied by explanations about moral awakening that he dismissed as weakness rather than evidence of recovered humanity. His contempt for conscience that interfered with business was absolute and unyielding, making it clear that he viewed her ethical concerns as character flaws that threatened their partnership rather than signs of psychological health that might have saved her soul. The man she'd loved was incapable of understanding that money couldn't compensate for murdering innocent children. The sentence he pronounced was delivered with the same calm professionalism that characterized all his work. His decision that she'd become a liability requiring elimination, presented as if it were simply another business problem that needed to be solved efficiently. Her usefulness as partner had been negated by her unreliability as accomplice, while her knowledge of his operations made her continued existence dangerous to his future success. The fact that they'd shared a bed and made vows meant nothing when weighed against practical considerations about protecting his reputation among clients who valued discretion above all other qualities in their service providers. But the execution he planned for the woman who'd betrayed his trust would be more elaborate than his usual efficient killings, because personal betrayal required personal revenge that went beyond mere elimination to encompass suffering that would satisfy his need for retribution against someone who dared to interfere with his professional success. The torture he described would last for days rather than hours, with pain designed to punish her for choosing conscience over criminal loyalty, while serving as entertainment that would help him process the disappointment of losing a partner whose skills had made their collaboration so profitable. As he prepared instruments that would make her death a work of art rather than simple murder, Marguerite realized that loving a monster had prepared her for becoming his victim, but it hadn't prepared her for the possibility that evil might ultimately be defeated by someone who'd fallen far enough to understand its true nature. The opportunity for escape came when Remy's obsession with creating the perfect torture scenario led him to leave Marguerite alone while he traveled to a neighboring town to purchase specialized equipment that would make her death as painful and prolonged as possible. His confidence that broken ribs and terror would keep her helpless until his return revealed arrogance that had grown from years of complete control over his victims, making him careless about security measures that would have prevented escape attempts by someone with sufficient motivation to overcome physical limitations through sheer determination to survive. The preparation for flight had to be accomplished despite injuries that made every movement agony, but adrenaline and desperation provided strength that exceeded what her damaged body should have been capable of generating under normal circumstances. The supplies she gathered were limited to what could be carried in saddlebags while riding hard through territory where pursuit would be inevitable and mercy would be impossible if she was recaptured by someone whose professional reputation required that betrayal be punished in ways that would discourage future defiance from other potential accomplices. Her escape plan was simple because complex strategies were beyond her physical and mental capabilities in her current condition. The money she took from their hidden safe was enough to sustain her for months if she could avoid capture long enough to reach territory where Remy's influence didn't extend, but stealing his profits from murder felt like complicity in the crimes that had generated the wealth, even though using it for escape seemed morally justified under the circumstances. Every gold coin represented someone's death, making her theft feel like grave robbing rather than simple larceny. But survival required resources that couldn't be obtained through legal means when fleeing from someone whose criminal network included contacts throughout legitimate business and law enforcement communities. The letter she left behind was both confession and warning, documenting their criminal activities in enough detail to ensure that authorities would investigate their operations, while providing evidence that might protect future potential victims from contracts that had already been negotiated with clients expecting reliable service. Her betrayal of their partnership was complete and purposeful, designed to destroy Remy's ability to continue killing for profit, while accepting that exposure of their crimes would make her a fugitive from justice as well as from his personal revenge. The choice between partial redemption and complete destruction was easy when the alternative was torture that would serve no purpose beyond satisfying one man's wounded pride. The horse she saddled for her escape was the best animal in their stable, chosen for endurance rather than speed because survival would depend on maintaining distance from pursuit over days or weeks rather than simply outrunning immediate danger through superior velocity. As she rode away from the home where she'd learned to plan murders and count profits earned through innocent suffering, Marguerite understood that her flight was more than mere escape. It was the first step toward reclaiming humanity that had been sacrificed for gold that was worthless when weighed against the cost of earning it through evil that could never be justified by any amount of wealth or security. Remy's discovery of Marguerite's escape and theft was followed by systematic preparation for a pursuit that would demonstrate why he was considered the most dangerous bounty hunter in the Western Territories. His expertise in tracking fugitives being applied to someone who knew his methods intimately, but whose injured condition and limited resources made her vulnerable despite her knowledge of his capabilities. The rage that drove his determination to recapture his traitorous wife went beyond professional pride to encompass personal humiliation that demanded revenge elaborate enough to satisfy wounds that went deeper than mere business disappointment. The network he activated for tracking her included criminal contacts throughout multiple territories, with rewards offered for information that would lead to her capture, while warnings were distributed about the dangerous nature of someone who'd betrayed partnerships that had been sealed with shared participation in multiple murders. His description of her as armed, desperate, and potentially willing to kill anyone who threatened her freedom was accurate enough to ensure that attempts to apprehend her would be conducted with appropriate caution, while the substantial bounty he placed on her head would motivate serious efforts by people whose hunting skills rivaled his own. The manhunt that began within hours of discovering her flight was coordinated with military precision, utilizing techniques that had been perfected through years of pursuing fugitives who'd tried every possible method for avoiding capture by someone whose success rate was legendary among criminals who understood the realities of territorial law enforcement. His ability to predict her likely routes and destinations was based on intimate knowledge of her psychology and training, while his resources allowed him to position searchers at every location where she might seek shelter or supplies during her desperate flight toward whatever sanctuary she hoped to find. The psychological warfare he employed included spreading stories about her criminal activities that would make decent people reluctant to offer assistance to someone whose reputation for violence preceded her arrival in communities where strangers were already viewed with suspicion. His ability to manipulate information flow ensured that potential allies would see her as dangerous criminal rather than fleeing victim, while his influence with corrupt officials guaranteed that law enforcement would treat her as fugitive rather than witness whose testimony might expose criminal networks that extended into respectable society. But the most dangerous aspect of his pursuit was the personal nature of his motivation, because hunting his former wife for betraying their criminal partnership had become more important than any financial consideration or professional obligation that might have limited his methods in previous cases. The resources he was willing to invest in her recapture exceeded anything that business logic would justify, while his determination to make her suffering legendary among criminal circles meant that failure to retrieve her would damage his reputation in ways that could destroy his ability to command premium prices for future contracts. The woman who'd escaped his torture chamber had unwittingly made herself the most important target of his entire career, guaranteeing that he would spare no effort or expense in tracking her to whatever corner of the world she thought might provide sanctuary from his relentless pursuit. The mission where Marguerite finally found refuge was run by Father Beaumont, a French priest whose work with territorial outcasts had given him experience helping people whose past mistakes had made them unsuitable for polite society, but whose present repentance deserved opportunities for redemption that mainstream communities weren't willing to provide. His willingness to shelter fugitives without asking detailed questions about their crimes was balanced by insistence that sanctuary required genuine commitment to moral transformation, rather than mere temporary convenience while waiting for better options to develop. The confession she made to Father Beaumont was complete and devastating. Her detailed account of criminal activities that had funded comfortable lifestyle through systematic murder, leaving the experienced priest shaken by the scope of evil that had been embraced by someone whose intelligence and education should have prevented such moral collapse. His decision to provide sanctuary despite her admission of participating in multiple murders was based on belief that redemption was possible for anyone whose repentance was genuine rather than expedient, making her safety dependent on proving that her moral awakening was authentic rather than calculated strategy for avoiding consequences. The work he assigned as penance was physically demanding and emotionally challenging, requiring her to care for victims of the same kind of violence she'd helped perpetrate while confronting daily reminders of the suffering that her criminal activities had caused for innocent people, whose only mistake had been existing in a world where wealthy criminals could purchase their deaths from professionals like herself and Remy. The contrast between her current patients and her former victims was stark and constant, making psychological healing impossible to achieve without honest acknowledgement of evil that couldn't be excused or minimized. The community of refugees who shared the mission's protection included other people whose past crimes had made them unsuitable for conventional society, but whose present behavior demonstrated genuine commitment to moral transformation that went beyond mere adherence to rules in exchange for safety. Their acceptance of someone whose criminal activities had exceeded their own in scope and brutality was conditional on evidence that her repentance was producing actual changes in character rather than simply better control over destructive impulses that might resurface when circumstances became difficult. But the peace she found in service to others who'd suffered because of violence like what she'd perpetrated was constantly threatened by knowledge that Remy's pursuit would eventually lead him to the mission where her presence endangered everyone who'd offered her sanctuary in exchange for nothing more than promises to use redemption opportunities responsibly. The safety that Father Beaumont had provided was temporary at best, because someone with Remy's resources and determination would inevitably discover her location and arrive with enough firepower to destroy anyone who tried to protect her from justice that he intended to administer personally rather than through legal channels that might prove insufficiently brutal for his satisfaction. Remy's arrival at the mission came at dawn on a Sunday morning when the community was gathered for services that celebrated redemption and forgiveness, his presence transforming their sanctuary into a battlefield where evil would confront the possibility of genuine moral transformation. The dozen gunmen he'd brought to ensure success outnumbered the mission's defenders, but Father Beaumont's refusal to surrender someone under his protection set the stage for violence that would test whether faith could triumph over force when the stakes included souls as well as lives. The siege that followed was unlike anything in Remy's previous experience, because the people defending Marguerite weren't motivated by money or fear, but by belief that protecting someone seeking redemption was worth dying for, regardless of what crimes she'd committed before arriving at their sanctuary. Their willingness to face professional killers armed with superior weapons, while possessing only basic firearms and improvised fortifications, demonstrated courage that went beyond mere desperation to encompass conviction that some principles were more important than personal survival or practical considerations about odds of success. Marguerite's decision to surrender herself rather than allow others to die for her protection was prevented by Father Beaumont's insistence that sanctuary meant protection until death for both protector and protected, making her safety a matter of religious principle rather than practical calculation about acceptable losses. His declaration that the mission would fight to the last person rather than betray someone who'd sought forgiveness created a moral clarity that simplified the conflict into a battle between good and evil that couldn't be resolved through negotiation or compromise. The battle that erupted when Remy's patience with negotiation expired was brutal and decisive, with professional killers discovering that people fighting for redemption possessed motivation that exceeded what mere financial incentives could provide. The defenders' intimate knowledge of the mission's layout and their willingness to sacrifice themselves for others transformed superior numbers and equipment into disadvantages that couldn't overcome determination based on faith rather than fear. When the shooting stopped, 6 of Remy's gunmen lay dead while the mission's casualties were limited to wounds rather than deaths that would have ended their commitment to protecting those seeking sanctuary. But the personal confrontation between Marguerite and Remy transcended the larger battle to become a final accounting between two people whose love had been corrupted by evil that had ultimately destroyed their capacity for any relationship except the predatory dynamic between hunter and prey. His fury at her betrayal was matched by her determination to prevent him from harming anyone else who'd offered kindness to someone seeking redemption, making their fight as much about the possibility of moral transformation as about personal survival. When Remy fell with her bullet through his heart, his death marked the end of a criminal partnership that had terrorized the territories while proving that love without moral foundation was just another form of violence that consumed everything it touched. The aftermath of the battle at the mission brought territorial authorities who'd been hunting Remy for years, their investigation of the scene revealing evidence that connected him to dozens of unsolved murders throughout multiple territories while establishing Marguerite as both accomplice and eventual opponent of someone whose criminal activities had made him one of the most wanted men in the American West. Her voluntary surrender to Sheriff Martinez was accompanied by complete confession that provided details about criminal networks that had operated with impunity for years while masquerading as legitimate business enterprises. The trial that followed became a sensation throughout the territories, with Marguerite's testimony exposing corruption that reached into territorial government while revealing the scope of organized crime that had been hidden behind facades of respectability and religious piety. Her willingness to accept responsibility for her crimes, while providing evidence that would prevent future victims from suffering similar fates, demonstrated genuine repentance that impressed even prosecutors who demanded her execution for participating in multiple murders that had terrorized innocent families throughout the region. The sentence she received reflected both the severity of her crimes and the value of her cooperation in exposing criminal enterprises that had corrupted territorial law enforcement while enabling systematic violence against people who couldn't afford protection from professional killers. 20 years in territorial prison was less than what her crimes deserved, but more than what her testimony had earned, creating a compromise between justice and mercy that satisfied neither her victims' families nor her supporters who believed redemption should eliminate all consequences for past evil. The work she did during her imprisonment continued the moral transformation that had begun at the mission, with her efforts to educate fellow prisoners and assist with legal appeals demonstrating commitment to helping others that went beyond mere performance designed to impress parole boards or prison officials. Her reputation among inmates and guards evolved from dangerous criminal to someone whose past mistakes had created wisdom that could prevent others from making similar choices, making her presence beneficial rather than threatening to institutional goals of rehabilitation rather than mere punishment. The letters she received from people whose lives had been saved by her testimony against criminal networks revealed that her betrayal of evil had produced good that exceeded the harm caused by her participation in murder for profit. Though the mathematics of moral accounting couldn't eliminate guilt that would haunt her for the rest of her life, regardless of how many people benefited from her decision to choose redemption over continued criminality. The woman who'd chosen love over safety had ultimately chosen justice over love, proving that even the most corrupted souls could find paths toward redemption if they possessed courage to sacrifice everything for principles that transcended personal interests or emotional attachments. 15 years after her release from territorial prison, Marguerite had built a new life as director of a school for children whose parents had been victims of the same kind of violence she'd once helped perpetrate, her work funded by donations from people who understood that prevention was more valuable than punishment when addressing cycles of crime that destroyed families and communities throughout the frontier territories. The children under her care would never know that their beloved teacher had once planned the murders of other children, but her dedication to their welfare was motivated by memories that made every small kindness feel like partial payment on debts that could never be fully settled. The peace she'd found in service to others was complicated by knowledge that her redemption had been purchased through blood that included Remy's death at her own hands, making her status as reformed criminal dependent on violence that contradicted everything she'd learned about moral transformation through the mission's teachings about forgiveness and non-resistance to evil. The man she'd loved and killed had been both monster and victim, his corruption complete, but his humanity real enough to make their final confrontation tragic, rather than simply necessary for protecting innocent people from continued predation. The students who graduated from her school carried lessons about moral courage and personal responsibility that went beyond academic subjects to encompass understanding about choices that determined character and destiny in ways that couldn't be undone through good intentions or belated regret. Her teaching emphasized the importance of ethical decision-making in small matters as preparation for larger tests that would determine whether temporary expedients would be chosen over permanent principles when pressure made compromise seem like the only practical alternative to disaster. The visitors who came to hear her speak about the costs of choosing evil over virtue included law enforcement officials, religious leaders, and community activists who recognized that her unique perspective on criminal psychology could help them understand and prevent the kind of moral collapse that had transformed a respected teacher into someone capable of planning the murders of children for money. Her willingness to discuss her crimes honestly while accepting full responsibility for choices that couldn't be blamed on circumstances or pressures that others had survived without becoming killers made her testimony particularly valuable for people seeking to understand how good people could become evil. The legacy she hoped to leave was measured not in the lives she'd destroyed during her criminal years, but in the lives she'd saved through testimony that had exposed networks of corruption while creating opportunities for others to choose redemption over continued participation in evil that would have consumed their souls as thoroughly as it had once consumed hers. The bounty hunter who'd promised gold for her hand had taught her that love without moral foundation was worthless, while the choice she'd ultimately made to sacrifice safety for justice had proven that redemption was possible even for people who'd fallen farther than they'd believed they could survive. Her story had become legend throughout the territories, not as celebration of romance that conquered all obstacles, but as warning about prices that must be paid when love required choosing between conscience and comfort, between redemption and security, between the person you'd become and the person you'd once been before evil had offered wealth in exchange for everything that made life worth living.